Welcome to That Police Officer's channel. If you're new here, let me introduce you to what we do. As a police officer, I examine some of the most disturbing, tragic, and complex criminal cases, all from a law enforcement perspective. These are the cases that shake communities, challenge investigators, and remind us of both the darkest and most determined aspects of human nature. Today, our investigation has taken us to the small town of Stella, Missouri, a community that never imagined it would become the center of such a horrific crime. This is the story of Rowan Ford, a 9-year-old girl whose disappearance triggered an urgent search effort and an investigation that revealed an unimaginable betrayal. November 2007 seemed like any other autumn month in Stella, but beneath the quiet normalcy, a crime was unfolding that would devastate Rowan's family and haunt the town forever. One moment, she was a child with a bright smile, full of life and promise. The next, she was gone. In the days that followed, the desperate search for answers took a disturbing turn as investigators uncovered impossible truths, ones that no one in this community was prepared for. But the big questions in this case are, how could this have happened? Who was responsible for such a monstrous act? And why did the very people who should have protected her instead become the source of her greatest danger? Good thing is I have all the answers to the questions and even more disturbing ones, and we'll be answering all the questions in today's investigation. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, this is the right time to do so. Stay with us as we dive into the details of Rowan Ford's case, the investigation, the confessions, and the legal battles that followed. We'll analyze how law enforcement tackled the case, the evidence that led to the ultimate arrests, and the lasting impact of this tragedy on Rowan's loved ones and the justice system itself. Stella, Missouri, is the kind of town where people take comfort in their quiet surroundings. It's a small, rural community where families look out for one another and where children, like 9-year-old Rowan Ford, should have been safe. But in November 2007, that sense of security was shattered when Rowan was reported missing, setting off a frantic search that would uncover an unthinkable crime. Rowan was a bright and kind-hearted girl, known for her love of school and her gentle nature. She lived with her mother, Colleen Spears, and her stepfather, David Spears. On the night of November 2, 2007, Colleen went to work for her overnight shift, leaving Rowan in David's care. It was a routine arrangement, nothing out of the ordinary, except this time, Rowan would not be there when her mother returned home the next morning. When Colleen walked through the door on November 3rd, she immediately noticed something was wrong. Rowan wasn't in her bedroom, nor anywhere in the house. Confused, she woke David and asked where her daughter was. His response? That Rowan had spent the night at a friend's house. But when Colleen began calling around and searching the neighborhood, she realized something was terribly wrong. No one had seen Rowan, and no one knew where she was. As hours passed with no sign of her daughter, Colleen could no longer ignore the growing fear in her chest. She called 911 and reported Rowan missing, triggering an immediate police response. Officers arrived at the scene and began their search, scouring the home and the surrounding area for any clues. But Rowan was nowhere to be found. It didn't take long for investigators to turn their attention to David Spears, the last person known to have seen Rowan. His story was shaky from the start. First, he told police she was at a friend's house. Then, when officers pressed him for details, his answers became vague and inconsistent. He couldn't name the friend, nor could he explain why he hadn't reported Rowan missing himself. That alone was a major red flag. Any parent or step-parent who realizes a child is gone would call the police immediately, but Spears had waited. As the investigation continued, another name emerged, Christopher Collings. A longtime friend of Spears, Collings had once lived with the family and had a close relationship with Rowan, who called him Uncle Chris. By the time of Rowan's disappearance, Collings had moved to a rural property in Wheaton, Missouri, where he lived in a trailer. Authorities soon learned that on the night Rowan vanished, Spears, Collings, and another friend, Nathan Mahurin, had been drinking together. They had spent the evening purchasing alcohol, playing pool, and eventually, Spears had left Rowan home alone to go drinking at Collings' trailer. As the search for Rowan intensified, police began questioning those closest to her. Collings, when initially approached, acted concerned and even offered to help find her. But there was something off about his demeanor. Wheaton's chief of police, Clinton Clark, a man who had known Collings for 17 years, later recalled that Collings seemed not his normal self when discussing Rowan's disappearance. Days passed with no leads, and the community of Stella rallied together in an effort to find the missing girl. The case had gained national attention, and local law enforcement received assistance from the FBI. But despite extensive searches and interviews, Rowan remained missing. Then, on November 9th, the worst possible news came. Search teams discovered a body in Fox Cave, a remote, heavily wooded area roughly 10 miles from where Rowan had lived. She was found partially clothed, lying in what was described as a sinkhole rather than a traditional cave. It was immediately clear that she had not simply wandered off and gotten lost. Something far more sinister had happened. The discovery of Rowan's body turned the case from a missing person investigation into a homicide. Law enforcement had already been circling around their primary suspects, but now, with the reality of Rowan's fate, the pressure intensified. When confronted with the evidence, Collings eventually broke. He confessed to the unthinkable, admitting his role in Rowan's murder. An autopsy, which we'd investigate later, would confirm that Rowan had died from strangulation, solidifying what investigators already knew. This was a brutal and deliberate crime. Collings was formally charged with first-degree murder, as well as additional charges related to the assault of Rowan. David Spears, while not directly responsible for her murder, faced charges of child endangerment for his role in leaving Rowan alone and vulnerable that night. For a small town like Stella, this case was beyond devastating. It wasn't just about the loss of a child. It was about the betrayal of trust. Rowan wasn't taken by a stranger. She wasn't abducted by someone passing through town. She was harmed by people who were supposed to protect her, and that realization left the entire community reeling. As the trial approached, prosecutors made it clear that they would seek the death penalty for Collings. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His confession, forensic findings, and witness testimonies all pointed to his guilt. The court would eventually convict him of first-degree murder, sentencing him to death in 2012. His execution is scheduled for December 3, 2024. This case serves as a grim reminder that danger doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes, the greatest threats exist within the very walls meant to keep us safe. The loss of Rowan Ford will never be forgotten, and the impact of her tragic story continues to be felt, not only by her loved ones but by all who followed this heartbreaking case. Now this is just a peek in the story. In the next section, we'll break down the investigation in greater detail. How law enforcement found out the truth, the forensic evidence that played a crucial role, and the interrogations that led to confessions. Consider subscribing to our channel and giving this video a like. Your support motivates us to continue sharing the most shocking and intriguing true crime stories with you. When a child goes missing, every second counts. In Rowan Ford's case, the first few hours were already gone by the time law enforcement was called in. That delay meant we were working against time. Evidence could have been lost, memories could have faded, and the suspect or suspects had a head start. But that didn't mean we were going to stop. From the moment the 911 call came in, our job was clear: find Rowan and uncover the truth. The initial response was swift. Officers arrived at the Spears home and conducted a thorough search of the house and surrounding areas. Standard procedure dictated that we start with the last known location of the missing person. If Rowan had walked out of the house on her own, there would have been some indication: an open door, a missing jacket, footprints leading away. But there was nothing. Interviews began immediately. Colleen Spears, Rowan's mother, was distraught and desperate for answers. She insisted that her daughter wouldn't have run away. That meant we had to consider the possibility that Rowan had been taken. The first person we looked at was David Spears, the last known person to have seen her. Right away, something was off. Spears' story wasn't adding up. He told us Rowan had stayed at a friend's house, but he couldn't name the friend. When pressed, his timeline of events kept shifting. First, he claimed she had been home when he fell asleep. Then, he suggested she might have wandered off. He was defensive, avoiding direct answers to simple questions. That behavior raised immediate red flags. As investigators, we're trained to recognize deception, hesitation, inconsistencies, nervous body language. It wasn't just what Spears was saying, but how he was saying it. And then there was the biggest issue. Why had he waited so long to report Rowan missing? No parent or step-parent should hesitate to call 911 when a child disappears. The delay alone suggested there was more to the story. With Spears already under scrutiny, we expanded our focus. Who else had been around that night? That's when we learned about Christopher Collings. A known friend of Spears, as mentioned earlier, Collings had previously lived with the family and was familiar with Rowan. He had a reputation for heavy drinking and drug use, traits that made him someone worth looking into. As officers gathered information, we traced Spears' movements from the night before. That's when another key witness emerged, Nathan Mahurin. He was with Spears and Collings that evening, drinking and partying. His account gave us more details about what happened that night. We learned that after buying alcohol, Spears and Mahurin had left Collings at his trailer before returning home. The question was, did Rowan ever leave the house at all? We needed physical evidence. That's when we brought in the FBI to assist with forensics. We searched Spears' home, his truck, and even a vehicle borrowed from a family member. At the same time, we started building a psychological profile of our suspects. Spears was proving unreliable, and Collings was starting to stand out as the person who might know more than he was saying. Then came the moment that shifted the case. While on patrol, Wheaton Police Chief Clinton Clark was flagged down by Collings himself. That move alone was suspicious. Collings seemed agitated, overly eager to talk about Rowan's disappearance. He claimed he was searching for her, but his behavior didn't match that of an innocent man. His excitement wasn't concern, it was nervousness. We pressed harder. On November 4th, we pulled Collings in for questioning. His story mirrored Mahurin's, but with slight differences, another sign of deception. We asked him to take a polygraph test and a computer voice stress analysis, CVSA. He agreed, but that didn't mean he was in the clear. Then came the discovery we had been dreading. On November 9th, search teams found Rowan's body in Fox Cave. She was partially clothed, left in a remote wooded area, confirming what we had suspected all along. This wasn't just a case of a missing child. This was a murder. With new evidence, we re-interviewed Collings. The pressure was building, and it didn't take long before he cracked. He confessed. Not only did he admit to taking Rowan, but he also detailed what had happened that night in horrifying detail. His confession confirmed that Rowan had been strangled, and the crime had been deliberate. Now, we needed to ensure justice. The confession alone wasn't enough. We needed forensic proof. We examined the crime scene, collected DNA, and tested Collings' vehicle for any traces of Rowan. Every step was taken to ensure that there would be no loopholes in the case. As for Spears, his role in the crime was also under investigation. While he wasn't directly responsible for Rowan's murder, he had left her home alone, vulnerable to the events that followed. His failure to act, his failure to protect her, couldn't be ignored. He was charged with child endangerment and later sentenced to 11 years in prison. Collings faced a much harsher fate. The evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecution sought the death penalty. In 2012, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder. The court had no doubts. This was an act of pure evil, and the punishment had to match the crime. His execution was scheduled for December 3, 2024. The case of Rowan Ford wasn't just another investigation. It was a reminder of why we do this job. Rowan deserved to be safe. She deserved a life full of dreams, laughter, and love. Instead, she became the victim of those who should have protected her. For the officers who worked this case, it was personal. This wasn't just about solving a crime. It was about standing for Rowan, making sure her story was told, and ensuring that justice was served. In the next section, we'll look at the courtroom battle, the trial that determined the fate of the men responsible and the emotional impact it had on Rowan's loved ones. Stay with us as we continue to examine this tragic case. In the meantime, subscribe to the channel. You don't want to miss stories like this in the future. When we make an arrest, the job isn't over. The courtroom becomes the next battleground, where justice is put to the test. In Rowan Ford's case, the weight of the evidence was undeniable, But that didn't mean the process would be simple. With Christopher Collings in custody and his confession on record, the prosecution wasted no time. He was charged with first-degree murder, forcible rape, and statutory rape. The severity of these charges meant that the state would seek the harshest punishment available. At the same time, David Spears, Rowan's stepfather, was facing his own charges, not for the murder itself, but for his failure to protect her. As the legal process moved forward, the public's reaction was strong. Rowan's murder had sent shockwaves through the community. People wanted justice, and they wanted it swiftly. But justice doesn't move quickly. Every detail had to be examined, every motion had to be argued, and every piece of evidence had to stand up in court. During pretrial hearings, Collings' defense attempted to suppress his confession, arguing that he had been pressured by investigators. But the judge ruled against him. The confession was obtained lawfully, and it was clear that he had given it voluntarily. That ruling was a major victory for the prosecution. The trial itself was brutal. Rowan's family had to sit through horrifying details of what had happened to their little girl. The prosecution presented the forensic evidence, the timeline of events, and, most damning of all, Collings' own words. When his taped confession was played for the jury, the entire courtroom was silent. There was no escaping what he had done. The jury didn't take long to deliberate. On March 12, 2012, Christopher Collings was found guilty of first-degree murder. But there was still one decision left to make: his sentence. The state wanted the death penalty, and given the nature of the crime, there was little doubt they would get it. During the sentencing phase, the defense tried to argue for life in prison instead, citing Collings' history of drug abuse and claiming he wasn't fully in control of his actions. But the jury wasn't swayed. What he had done was deliberate, calculated, and beyond forgiveness. In the end, they sentenced him to death. But was sentencing him to death the right call? Should he have been given life in prison instead? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're down there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more in-depth cases. For Rowan's family, it was justice, but it wasn't closure. Nothing could bring her back. No sentence, no matter how severe, could erase what had happened. David Spears, meanwhile, faced his own day in court. His actions, while not as monstrous as Collings, had contributed to Rowan's fate. His neglect, his lies, and his failure to report her missing in time made him accountable. He pleaded guilty to child endangerment and was sentenced to 11 years in prison. Many in the community felt that wasn't enough. For law enforcement, this case was one we wouldn't forget. We had worked tirelessly to bring Rowan home, only to find her too late. The only thing we could do was ensure the people responsible never had the chance to hurt another child. Justice had been served, but the scars remained. Investigators, prosecutors, and community members carried the weight of this case long after the verdict. One officer, who had worked on the case from the beginning, still carried Rowan's picture in his wallet, a reminder of why we do this job, and of the innocent life that was stolen too soon. Collings is now sitting on death row, with his execution scheduled for December 3, 2024. It will mark the final chapter in a case that devastated a family, a town, and the officers who worked it. As we close this case, we remember Rowan Ford. She was more than just a victim. She was a little girl with dreams, a family who loved her, and a future that was stolen by those who should have protected her. Reflecting on the tragic case of Rowan Ford, it's evident that the impact of her loss reverberated far beyond her immediate family, touching the community and law enforcement officers deeply involved in the investigation. Rowan's mother, Colleen Munson, faced unimaginable grief following the loss of her daughter. The betrayal by her then-husband, David Spears, who was implicated in the crime, compounded her anguish. This profound personal tragedy led Colleen to file for divorce, seeking to distance herself from the painful associations and begin a path toward healing. The small town of Stella, Missouri, was profoundly shaken by Rowan's disappearance and subsequent murder. In tight-knit communities, such events pierced the collective sense of security and trust. Residents rallied together, organizing searches and vigils, demonstrating solidarity and a shared commitment to seeking justice for Rowan. The case served as a somber reminder of the vulnerabilities present even in seemingly safe environments. For the officers involved, the case was both professionally challenging and emotionally taxing. Detective Jennings, reflecting on the investigation, expressed the lasting impact it had on him, stating, "I still carry her picture with me. I've worked hundreds of homicides, and this one will always stay with me." Such sentiments underscore the deep personal connections and the weight of responsibility felt by those tasked with seeking justice for the most vulnerable victims. The tragic death of Rowan Ford highlights critical issues surrounding child safety, the importance of community vigilance, and the profound responsibilities of caregivers. It also emphasizes the necessity for law enforcement to approach such sensitive cases with both professional rigor and compassionate understanding. The case serves as a poignant reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring impact of violence on families, communities, and those sworn to protect them. In remembering Rowan, we are called to reflect on the measures needed to protect our children and support those affected by such tragedies, ensuring that justice serves not only as a response, but also as a deterrent to future acts of violence.